Greetings. This video was supposed to be one of the more sleazier episodes, and I even had, like, a new game in the background. Isn't that crazy? But it didn't really work the way I wanted it to be honest. And I inevitably looked over the recording right after uploading it to YouTube this morning, and I was like, God damn, this is beyond horrible. Going to lie, not only was the teacher a little out of it, though I still did appreciate him. The people I didn't appreciate was the students. So I decided that I'd just take the liberty of re-recording it for everyone, so here it is. Now, poetry is a big thing of mine. It obviously wasn't as big as it used to be, but there would be times where I would specifically go out of my way just to write poetry and slack on the novel that I was, supposed to be working on. But either way, it was what it was, and I enjoyed what I was toning my craft into nonetheless. And in junior year, I was invited to, what is this? I was invited to a poetry class, hosted in my school for junior year to get some art/music credit, because I am not doing music for shit. I'll leave the reasoning to why for another time, but anything else. Thank you. However, when I entered the class, and I'm not gonna name the teacher just for good measure, but when I entered the class, I realized that it was not exactly what I expected. I was expecting some, bearded guy who clearly overdosed on opioids the night before to start yelling pretentious slang all over and showing us what exactly it is to be, a poet. However, instead I got this guy who seemed more like a musician than a poet, and you can argue that that's kind of the same thing. However, in my opinion, he seemed like he would be much happier doing other things, and that teaching to him was just a side job where he can make a consistent payout of with gigs in the back. We knew he did gigs, that was for one thing. However, sometimes when I'd enter his class and see his lessons, I'd see him type on a slide 5 minutes before everyone would arrive, and by everyone I mean 6 people, because that was realistically the amount of people that actually entered the class. And at the beginning of the class, he did a show of hands on who exactly is actually interested in poetry in the beginning, and a whopping 2 hands went up. That was me, and that was this one other girl who I also won't name, I might as well. However, it was what it was, and we tried our best to make the most of it, and by we I mean him, mostly, but not to say that I wasn't trying to. And I kinda try-harded the class a little bit, I'm not gonna lie, it was a bit of a sweat, if I do say so myself, and oh my god, and sorry, it's something in game. And he really loved all the work that I'd share and put out for practice in his class. Maybe because of the whole, how do I say this? Mainly because of what the competition was looking like, but otherwise, I'm not here to diss people. It was okay, is what I'm trying to say. But we do a lot of activities in the class. We do blackout poetry, which is one of the most annoying things ever. And we do, modernism and analyze specific texts and all that. But I think the thing that stuck with me the most was something called a poetry slam. And a poetry slam is basically where you take poetry that you would create and you would present it in front of a wide audience, and these can be underground sessions, and it seems to have been more popular around the 2000s, really, because most of the most influential poetry slam videos that we saw were originated around that time. But if there is some sort of secret society of poetry slam people during recent times, and I wouldn't be too surprised, but at the same time I don't believe it's as popular as it once was. Oh well. Either way, poetry slams existed, and we were forced to make our own, which I looked over nowadays, and I was oh my god. Sorry. I was beyond shocked, to be honest, because though I did appreciate the practice, I looked over a lot of the old works that I'd turn in as assignments, and I'd simply be appalled, because he taught us a lot of principles. He taught us pentameter and all descriptive language and such, but there was something different about how I'd usually write poetry for his class and for, I don't know, a writing competition, for example, because we'd have prompts all over the place and whatnot. However, I think the only way I can really convey this awkwardness is if I actually read one of the poems, and bear with me here, I am gonna pause a little in-game to share this, but I hope I hope you can understand what I'm talking about. So I'll read a short little excerpt that I submitted and that he complimented the hell out of when I submitted it, and you can draw your own conclusions. Okay. And that's okay, I understand. Most human failure comes and goes, and it'll go like flies and cries and snakes and mossy lakes and snow. Cause just like leaves, they change and change like every raucous fiend at bay. They all get bored and pack their bags as long as nothing's left to stay. And then the poem goes into more contemplative things like, what does it really mean to mess with one's character? It's like fixing an engine using, like, at that point, it fit the prompt, don't get me wrong, but I began to kind of hate my own writing, if that makes sense. He taught us all these principles and whatnot, which seemed more like rules than anything, and you know what, maybe that would have sufficed for a writing class or whatever, which, I mean, it was a writing class at the end of the day. However, I was just so... I was really frustrated with it, and even though I'm kind of giving meta commentary on this now, I do remember that I was beyond frustrated writing assignments like this. You see, poems, or the ones that I'd make on my own spare time, they wouldn't take as long as when I'd have to do this. I think that poem in its entirety lasted. It took me about 2 or 3 hours to write like half of it, which ended up being like a 5-hour thing. And obviously it was split around several days, but the point is I was just slunched over at a desk like nothing short of frustrated, and it was horrible. It honestly, I think that's why I ended up inevitably writing poetry less, because it just wasn't an experience that I truly loved anymore. It was just one that I was following principle, and some people benefit from following only principle, but I'm not one of those people. I really, you know, creativity and love for creativity is the only thing that really drives me to write this. And that leads me to my greater point, where, you know, I even wrote this in my college personal statement, where I can do anything for any amount of time, and if I don't end up like actually having like a connection with it, not only with like characters of a plot or like loving exactly what happens or being proud of it, but I mean loving the process and being happy with perfectionism, which is obviously more of a curse than anything, but just loving your craft. It's so important, and the worst part is that it's so inconsistent. You can just wake up one day and realize that, oh, you don't want to do this. And this doesn't even apply to writing anymore. This applies to pretty much everything. So in my eyes, it's a scary thought. And to help with loving craft, I tend to lean toward more not vulgar, but definitely more drastic themes at times. I try to search for things that are obviously not cliches, because writing cliches is a fate worse than prison, in my opinion. But I mean, it basically is purgatory. I cannot lie. However, because of me wanting to lean into these, you know, these greater themes, I tend to lean in toward things like, I don't know, love, for example, or death, or just overall shock value. And that was one of the biggest mistakes as a writer that I would make back then, where I would write things solely for the shock value and never give the audience a chance to breathe, but two, a chance to, have juxtaposition in the sense that you need the good in order to really feel the bad, or else the reader just gets desensitized. And in my opinion, that's a big lesson in writing that I think can be agreed upon. Why do you think comic relief exists in literature? It's very, very important. But especially on my poetry back then, I would always lean toward these more these heavier topics that I didn't really quite understand either. But even then, those got boring, because desensitization is not something of the reader, it's of the writer as well. And I eventually got sick of writing, poems about someone getting heartbroken or frustrated that their partner no longer likes them, and so on and so forth. Even though that used to be my niche, that was what I uploaded in the writing competition that I had such a strong reaction toward. But even then, that I grew sick of. Death I grew sick of, writing about death. Not as much as love, of course, but it still to a similar extent. But I think the main idea is that I always want more in terms of my literature. And even though I don't write poetry that much anymore, I still do write pretty often. I have that TRPG, which I'll speak about eventually. But I think one of my biggest desires of literature is wanting to actually have an emotional reaction to media. Because not only I think I mentioned this before in an earlier episode, where me trying to go out of my way to experience media that will make me cry, because that has not really happened before. But it's just, I think that the biggest thing here with love and death that I didn't really mention is that they all have to do with loss or sadness in some way. And in my opinion, I feel like there is a pleasure in terms of sadness, and I think the best way to describe it is the whole concept of catharsis in terms of old literature that you might have already heard of. The whole, oh wow, emotional catharsis, where you let out your own emotions by experiencing secondhand the grief of a character. And that is honestly what I am trying to seek, no matter what. So I think I'll really conclude it in terms of this one specific concept that I looked for, and it's the whole thing where it's like no tears for the author, no tears for the reader, that sort of thing. And that is something I really did dwell upon for quite some time now, where, even in my most grandest scenes in my novel, not even just poetry, and this has obviously never happened in any of the assignments that I'd submit for my poetry class, but I've not only not had an emotional response in terms of consuming media, but the fact that I was not really feeling anything at all when it came to my actual writing was even more frustrating because I didn't know whether it was just a matter of, oh, am I writing this incorrectly, or am I simply just, not immersing, like, is it a matter of it not being immersive, or me not adequately immersing myself into it, if that makes sense. So, yeah. Therefore, to be honest, I think where I'm trying to go with this is that at the end of the day, I just want to make poetry, verse, or anything really, just something using the descriptive language that poetry class has taught me, or the iambic pentameter, or whatever ambigraph, or however you pronounce it these days, surfaces around, just anything, even a mastercraft in shock that will make me, write a draft and actually, in the middle of writing it, stop writing it entirely, and be, just, I'm watching my word choice here. Just something that will make me bury myself in my own tears or whatnot, and ultimately make me unable to finish it. Because even though making something especially profound and publishing it and making other people cry is, something that is a pleasure among writers, don't get me wrong, I feel like it's more beautiful entirely to have something that the author can write that ultimately affects them so much to the point where they struggle to finish it, not out of laziness, but simply because it's perfect unfinished. Half of me is kind of skeptical regarding this idea, but I do feel like I'm going somewhere with it. But whatever it is, that will probably be my goal for the unforeseeable future regarding poetry. And if I do ultimately end up continuing this trend of writing more poetry than writing novels and TRPGs and whatnot, then you'll probably see it on my little poetry escapades in whatever Instagram account or little thing I end up doing it on. But that should sum up poetry for me today. I do have to upload the other episodes, so I'm probably going to do that right after. So thank you for hearing me out regarding this. I know it was a bit of a hazy little conclusion here, but I hope you got something out of it. Again, I will be here today and tomorrow, and the day after, and have a lovely night.